I'd like to welcome you to Lincoln City Library's Lunch at the Library series. I'm Deb Arns, curator of the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors here at the Bennett Martin Public Library. And I'd like to take this time to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, whose support makes this series possible, and for their support of the Heritage Room's efforts to preserve and share Nebraska's literary heritage. I'd also like to mention that today's program is being filmed by LNK TV and will be available for viewing on public access television and also on the City of Lincoln and Lincoln City Library's YouTube accounts. A few notes about upcoming events. On Saturday, this Saturday, February 7th, Steve Shively will present the program Aaron Douglas from the University of Nebraska to Premier Artist of the Harlem Renaissance, which explores the work and Nebraska connection of African-American artist Aaron Douglas. And then information about the Lunch at the Library series is on your tables. And next month we'll feature Linda Paulenti, who is the author of the book Clutch. That'll be March 4th at 12:10. So today I will introduce our author, who is Matt Steinhausen. He's a sixth-generation Nebraskan, a photographer and a preservationist who earns his living conducting home and commercial property inspections. It is also reported that he has never used a smartphone, or, is that true? Okay. Or drunk a cup of coffee. Correct. Okay. His first book, The Least Interesting Place, is a coffee table book with a tongue-in-cheek title that features beautiful and genuinely interesting photographs of Nebraska. And his current book, which he'll talk about, is The Unauthorized Biography of Lincoln, Nebraska. It explores the history of Nebraska's capital city through photos, fascinating stories, and myth-busting insights. So please help me welcome Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Deb. Thanks for allowing me to talk. That's my favorite thing to do, especially about topics I'm interested in, and I love talking about Lincoln. I have notes here, not because I need them to keep me flowing, but to keep me focused, or else we'd be here for hours. I also want to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association for giving me and other authors this opportunity. If it wasn't for people writing, especially Lincolnites and Nebraskans, a lot of the research that went into this book wouldn't have been possible. Most of my research was reading books and other things written by Lincolnites and Nebraskans. And so I wanted to thank them. I wanted to thank the Lincoln City Libraries for providing us a place to do this, and the Heritage Room specifically, another interesting and fascinating resource that saves Nebraska literature. Another organization I want to thank is the Nebraska State Historical Society. Their resources were crucial to my work and a lot of other history projects, and also the archives and special collections of the UNL libraries. A good number of the photos that went into this book came from those resources. Before I start, I want you guys to know that overnight I changed my plans entirely on what I was going to talk about. So we're going to be winging it pretty hard today, but that makes it a lot more fun. So let's have some fun. I think what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for about a half hour or so, and then at the end of that, we're going to open the floor for questions. So someone's going to signal me when we get to a half hour, then we're going to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, try to remember them or write them down, and then I'll try to answer them later on. The focus of my talk today has shifted a little bit because I decided, since we're at a library in an event hosted by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, that we should maybe discuss some literary tidbits of Lincoln's history that I discovered in doing my research. And so we're going to talk about some of the lesser known parts of Lincoln's literary history and some of the little things that I discovered, the little nuggets. But a little bit about me. As Deb mentioned, I grew up around here. I went to school at Waverly. I went to Wesleyan University for a while. I went to the university. But I've almost always lived outside of the city limits of Lincoln. And I think I consider Lincoln like my little urban oasis. It's that place that I can see from a distance. And it's always made me curious and fascinated, more than I think I would have been had I grown up inside Lincoln. 5 years ago, Leslie Huerta asked if I'd written the book, The Least Interesting Place, and I was visiting her shop, and she had asked me if I'd consider writing a book about Lincoln. At the time, I hadn't, but that planted a seed, and that seed has grown into this book. So thanks, Leslie. She's here today, and she'll be helping me sell books after the talk. This was an all-local project. The books were written by me, published by me, edited by friends. I shouldn't say edited, proofread and focus grouped. And then there's a lot of mistakes in it because I was hasty, and I created a deadline for myself because Jim McKee, I heard him once say that if you don't create a deadline, you will continually be writing and editing. So I made a hard deadline for fall of 2025. And so there are a lot of mistakes in the book, but fortunately most of them are typos and not egregious errors of history. As I wrote in the introduction, or in the copyright page, that the errors were left in to throw off AI. My goal in writing this book was I wanted to write about things that made Lincoln unique. This is not just a rehashing of history. This is things that I found ironic, coincidental, interesting, mysterious, the kind of things that I thought would be interesting not only to Lincolnites, but to people who'd never even been to Lincoln before. So when I was writing, a lot of the work went into this was about looking at how would this read to someone who doesn't know anything about Lincoln. So I left out a lot of the trivial things that Lincolnites would probably prefer to have in the book, but that I thought wouldn't be interesting across the spectrum of potential readers. I consider Lincoln the 1 degree of separation city. We're all connected, just somehow, some way, by friends, coworkers, other kinds of relationships or experiences. As I say, Lincoln is the world's biggest small town. And I think a lot of you who are familiar with Lincoln would agree with me on that. One of the errors in the book, one of the typos was, I'd mentioned Leslie Huerta. She owns a bookshop over here. It's called Francie and Finch. And in the book, I thanked her and I wrote Francie and Finch with the word and spelled out, even though it's an ampersand. And that's still, every time I see that, it bugs the heck out of me. And I want to apologize publicly to Leslie for that. I also spelled Woodman, Accident in Life, wrong. I spelled it Woodman, not Woodmin. And the protective hand with the naked people in it across from the Capitol, that's called the protecting hand. I called it the protective hand in my book. So those are a few of the many errors. So I just wanted to make that clear in public I'm not perfect, and I'm willing to admit my errors. And while we're talking about admitting errors and the naked people on that building, did you guys know that the adults on that building aren't actually naked and never have been? A lot of people think they were naked when it was first made and then the clothes added later. A lot of my peers. A lot of my peers still remember them when they put up the scaffolding and removed the privates and added the clothes, which isn't what happened. But obviously you're a very intelligent audience, and I appreciate that. You know, there's a lot of, I mentioned I like irony, coincidence, mystery. Have you guys ever heard of a man named Young who was a religious leader that settled near Salt Flats? Brigham Young? Did you know Lincoln was founded by a man, a religious leader named Young, who settled by the Salt Flats? His name was Elder John McKesson Young, and in 1863, on July 4th, he came to Lincoln, Nebraska to find a place where he wanted to establish a women's seminary, a Methodist women's seminary. His motivations behind that, I'm unsure, but he had a number of other followers who came here with him on the 4th of July, and they established a colony here. And at the time, this was the village of Lancaster. And that was 1863. 1864, the first house was built in what became the city of Lincoln. And that house was built almost directly underneath where we're sitting here today. It was the home of Luke Lavender, who was one of John McKesson, Elder McKesson's followers. And he built a cabin, and they often attribute the location of that cabin to the corner of 14th and O Street, but we know it was further to the south and east of that. And so either the cabin was somewhere between here and 14th and O. We might be sitting above where his outhouse was. Probably more likely there. But I think that's kind of an interesting coincidence. Remember the irony, coincidence, mystery? We don't know exactly where his house was. That's part of the mystery. And a lot of the things I write about in my book are things that are unsolved about Lincoln history. And I think that's fun because sometimes the mystery is more interesting than the solution. According to folklore, when it was 4 years after they first settled here, that Elder Young came here, that the state of Nebraska the Nebraska Territory became a state, 1867. And it was decided to locate the capital somewhere south of the Platte River to appease the greater population of the state, and that it would be named Lincoln. And that's a whole nother story we're not going to talk about right now. But the capital commissioners came to here and chose the village of Lancaster as the site of Lincoln. And according to folklore, there were only 30-some odd citizens in Lancaster at the time. But after the politicians came, there were a lot more odd citizens. I attribute that quote to Roger Welsh. It's my version of it. But Roger Welsh was, you might remember, Captain Nebraska, Postcards from Nebraska. Roger Welsh, though we often associate him with Dannebrog, Nebraska, out in Howard County, he was actually born and raised in Lincoln. He was a descendant of Germans from Russia. And I say Russia because that's how they used to pronounce it here in Lincoln. It was the Russian Bottoms, not the Russian Bottoms. And that's something I learned in my research. The irony of choosing this location for the capital is they thought we were wealthy in salt. And it turns out there wasn't much salt, but just enough to taint our water so that we have to get our water from Ashland. And also just enough to make it so that we have rare habitats that can't be developed, so which is pretty cool, I think, but it's been the bane of a lot of developers. With those Methodists came the Methodist ideologies, and they stuck around for a long time, for 150 years. A lot of you remember, you couldn't buy alcohol in Lincoln on Sunday. There was no gambling other than horse racing. Before I was born, the generation or two before, you couldn't shop in Lincoln on Sunday, except not in a Christian-owned store. You couldn't play sports in Lincoln on Sunday. You had to go out to like Cushman Park outside the city limits to play sports. And you'd have to get on the streetcar or train, I guess, the train that would take you out to near Southwest 40th and O, where Cushman Park was located, because playing sports was against the Methodist doctrine at that point in time on Sundays. There's a lot of other Methodist influences on town. You remember, you might have known about part of Wilderness Park was where Epworth Park was located, where they'd have Chautauquas and where they'd have camps in the summer. Nebraska Wesleyan University and University Place, Methodist. A lot of people don't know there was another school up there developed by a Methodist just to the northeast of Wesleyan called the Haish Institute. It was the guy that, if you know anything about barbed wire, Jacob Haish invented a type of barbed wire. And he took his wealth and gave it to Methodist causes, including a school right next to Wesleyan. That school was burned down like the year after it was built and never rebuilt. So because Haish had so much money, he didn't insure it. This is another interesting tidbit that relates to Lincoln literature. Not Lincoln, you'll see where I'm going with this here in a bit. Nebraska Wesleyan was where two Nebraskans attended school, a gentleman named Glenn and his girlfriend, Grace. They came from Holdridge, Nebraska to attend school in Wesleyan. Grace's last name was Swanson. Glenn's last name was Hefner. And eventually, Grace and Glenn moved to Chicago, and they had a son named Hugh. And my understanding is that Grace and Glenn gave a lot of money, some money at least, to Nebraska Wesleyan, but we don't see any buildings at Wesleyan named after the Playboy magazine. See that connection to literature and Lincoln? There's a few stretches here. Speaking of irony, here's an ironic thing that has nothing to do with literature. It's more nomenclature. You guys know what a bread bun filled with cabbage and meat is called? Runza, right? The Runza's developed in Lincoln, or you know what I mean. I'm loosely. Right now, February only, you can get an Italian Runza. No cabbage. I would argue that's a calzone. That's a topic for another time, too. I mentioned the naked people on the Woodman building. The Woodman was started by the Faulkner family, Dr. A.O. Faulkner, and his home was at 40th and South Street. You might be familiar, on the northeast corner of 40th and South, there's a little acreage and a house called Park Hill, despite the fact it's not on a hill. But that was the home of A.O. Faulkner, and just to the east of that was another estate that was the home of Edwin Faulkner, A.O.'s son, and Edwin's son, E.J. Faulkner, later lived there. And another Faulkner that grew up there was Virginia Faulkner. And there's just been a biography about Virginia finished. And the irony of that is that Virginia Faulkner, who grew up in Lincoln, born here in the early 1900s, couldn't wait to get out. She was way ahead of her time. She was so smart that she started school, they advanced her 2 grades right off the bat. So she was in the same grade as her brother, who was 2 years older than her. When she was in her teenage years, she could be seen driving through Lincoln, smoking her cigarettes and speeding through the streets in her roadster and receiving speeding tickets. And I still wonder how they gave speeding tickets before wouldn't that be easy to prove hard to prove that you were speeding? But that's another thing. But Virginia was quite a character. She left Lincoln. She went to Italy. She went to New York City. She went to Hollywood. She hobnobbed with the rich and famous. And she became a pretty well-recognized writer, writing for publications, newspapers, magazines, that kind of stuff, periodicals, and very much respected in her field. But as her fast lifestyle, she couldn't keep up with it physically or mentally, and eventually returned to Lincoln. And the reason I think it's interesting is there's just been a biography finished about her, and I just read it, and I was fascinated by it, and I'm so glad that I included a little snippet about Virginia in this book, because I think it's just an interesting tidbit of Lincoln history. But she came back to Lincoln, and when she got back here, she went to work for the University of Nebraska Press, who was publishing books and not making a lot of money. And they saw an opportunity to create another division that would maybe create books that would have more widespread interest, and they called it Bison Books. And Bison Books and the University of Nebraska Press are still going. And the biography about Virginia Faulkner was published by Bison Books. Virginia also helped she didn't create. She was participated in the publication of the Prairie Schooner, the literary quarterly. She also helped revitalize the legacy of Willa Cather, and with her writing partner, Bernice Sloat, both of whom were at the University of Nebraska, Bernice and Virginia. Bernice also, like Virginia, was born in Nebraska and a literary talent, and she was originally from Hickman. A fascinating story to me about this that I just recently learned was that as Bernice and Virginia started to promote this revitalization of the legacy of Willa Cather, they pushed to have a stamp created in Cather's honor. And that stamp was created in 1973 thanks to Virginia's brother's influence, because Virginia's brother was big in the Republican Party at the time and had a lot of influence with our senators and representatives in Washington, D.C., and it didn't take too much effort on his part to get Willa Cather on a stamp. The cool part about this is in the background of that stamp is a rainbow. At the time, rainbows didn't represent gay culture, and they also it wasn't known what Willa Cather's sexuality was at the time. So I sometimes, this is my little tangential wandering mind, if maybe that wasn't the first connection between the rainbow and gay culture. But technically, if you look it up, the rainbow was put on flags officially in 1978 for the American, for a parade in San Francisco, the name of which I can't remember exactly. But Harvey Milk was the one that commissioned that flag in 1978. Did you know that University of Nebraska-Lincoln had a medical school? Not in Omaha. They had a medical school in Lincoln. In 1883, it was established. It got shut down 4 years later. And the reason it was shut down is because the legislature defunded it. And the reason the legislature defunded it is because bodies were missing from Wyuka Cemetery. At the time, it was very hard to obtain corpses. And the story is that there was a woman who was shot at her workplace from crossfire from maybe a jealous, jilted lover. She worked at 9th and P. And she was taken to Wyuka Cemetery, and her brothers came down days after her death to pick her up. But apparently, people thought no one would pick up this person, so she disappeared. It made headlines. A couple days later, her body showed back up at Wyuka, and the brothers took her home. We believe it was conscientious students at the university who brought the body back. But the point is, whether or not it was university students or teachers stealing bodies, we don't know, but it did, because of this mystery, the college did get shut down and defunded. But a private school called Cotner College still had a medical school after that. And in 1894, a sexton at Wyuka Cemetery noticed another grave was missing, had been disturbed. And they decided to excavate to determine if the body had been taken, and it had. And it was the grave of Otto Albert. And they notified the police, so the police thought maybe it went to Cotner College. So they waited for classes to get over. They went at night. They went into this building. Pretty ominous looking building too. If you can see this building here, this is Cotner College in Bethany. They go into that building under the 3rd or 4th floor where the dissection lab was at night, and they run into a janitor, and they tell the janitor, we need to get into the dissection lab, and the janitor says, I don't have a key. And they said, well, we're going to break down the door. And he says, just a minute. And he found the key. Because he would have been the one fixing the door. And sure enough, they found the body of Otto Albert. And they couldn't ever figure out who took it, so there were no charges, but the school was reprimanded. There were charges, but there were no convictions because they couldn't prove it. There's one more thing I want to talk about because I know we're getting pretty short on time, and I wanted to talk more about literature. And I'm going to talk about what I think is one of the most fascinating mysteries that I discovered in my research. And that's about an escape that happened at the state penitentiary in 1912. In 1912, 3 inmates obtained weapons and explosives, nitroglycerin, and they blew up the locks and shot the people trying to stop them from getting out of the penitentiary. One of those people shot was the penitentiary warden. Another person shot was the deputy warden. Another person shot was a guard, and all those men were killed. I believe all of them were killed. So these 3 guys get away. They don't get away far. They get up to a farm near 27th and Van Dorn, and it's snowing. It happened in November of 1912. I believe, I might have the dates wrong, but they get to this farm. They take the family hostage, and the family says, wait a minute, we got to milk cows. And they're like, you understand. So these escapees were like, okay, we'll help you milk, and then we need to eat your food and get your clothes and get on the road, which they did. They ended up in Cass County. There was a posse that caught up with them. And this book by Gail Christensen is called The Last Posse, and it's about that escape and the posse that caught up with the escapees killed one of them. Another one killed himself because he recognized there was no escape. And in that posse, they also accidentally killed the hostage that the prisoners had taken, who was a young farmer from the area. On the way back to Lincoln with the bodies of the two dead escapees, the sheriff at each stop, Gretna, Ashland, Greenwood, Waverly, would stop and hold up these bodies like trophies. Havelock. They eventually dumped the bodies down near 14th and Pioneers, and then the inmates, they brought 6 inmates out to carry the bodies back for examination in the prison. Another book about this whole scenario was written around the time it happened. In 1913, this book was published. It was called Hell in Nebraska. And this copy comes from the Heritage Room here at the library. And the fascinating thing about this book is it's written by a guy named Walter Wilson. And at the time, in 1912 and 1913 in Lincoln, there was a Walter Wilson, but he was an architect. I've done a lot of research, and I have not found a Walter Wilson in Lincoln who was either an inmate or clerk. Walter Wilson described himself in this book as being a clerk of the warden who was also an inmate, like Andy Dufresne in Shawshank Redemption. It was a really well-written book. It's fascinating to me. It's available online if you do some exploration for free. So if you're curious, I'd encourage you to check it out, because in print, it's hard to come by. But the thing is, this book, it accused, the press at the time claimed that the reason the inmates got weapons and were able to escape is because the government and the warden were not doing their job. But the book says the warden and the state were doing a great job. It was clergy visiting the inmates who brought them the weapons. 40 years later, almost 40 years later, 30-some years later, the surviving escapee on his deathbed admitted that it was clergy who brought him the weapons and how they escaped. So what Walter Wilson was doing was trying to correct the facts, to rewrite history from what the press was doing. Later on, after I read that book, I discovered this. This is a leather-bound copy of Hell in Nebraska. And on the front, it's stamped, foil stamped, to Governor and Mrs. Aldrich from the author. So Walter Wilson gave this book to the governor. However, there's no signature. So who's Walter? Don't you think, I've written some books. If I was given a book to the governor, I would definitely sign it, and I would think Walter Wilson would too. So who's Walter Wilson? I don't know, but on this copy in the library, it's signed over the author's signature, C.W. Knott, or over the author's name. And I just think it was the owner, probably, that signed it there, C.W. Knott, or maybe C.W. Knott knew the secret. As I say, the mystery is more interesting than the solution. But that leads me to another story I want to tell you guys, and that's about one of Lincoln's most interesting characters, a guy by the name of Addison E. Sheldon. Because Addison E. Sheldon, his dad died when he was a little kid up in Minnesota. His mom came to Seward County and homesteaded with Addison, 8-year-old Addison. Addison grew up to AE, as he went by, I believe. He went to school at Doane. He went to school at the university, and then eventually to Columbia in New York City. Then he came back to Lincoln and married Daniel Denton's daughter. And Daniel Denton is who the town Denton, Nebraska is named after. So they got married, and then they immediately went up to near Cody, Nebraska, and tried to make a go at like ranching and farming. And they did that for about 3 years, and then AE moved the family to Chadron, where he became editor of a paper, and he became a legislator right here in the state capitol. AE, then his wife died, and he moved his family to Lincoln. He remarried, and he became a writer and editor. And for a few years, eventually, he was appointed by the governor to lead the Nebraska State Historical Society. And he started History Nebraska magazine, and he was the editor of History Nebraska. Addison E. Sheldon, fascinating guy. Between 1910 and 1914, when this book was written, Addison Sheldon's resume is relatively blank. I don't know if Addison Sheldon wrote this book, but I think it's possible. And it's something I really want to investigate further, and I've been preoccupied with it. But I'm honored. I have the governor's copy here, which is pretty cool. But think about it. The writer of this book gave the governor a leather-bound, foil-stamped copy and didn't sign it. And a few years later, Addison E. Sheldon was appointed to lead the State Historical Society. So is it cause-effect? I don't know. I want to say a few more little tidbits here that I think are interesting. I'm just going to say one. Do you ever go down to the Haymarket and see that train? Did you know that train was built in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Burlington shops? It's one of the few engines that they made out the Burlington shops. And some of you might remember the sledding hill at Pioneers Park. That engine is the same engine that used to be at the top of the sledding hill, as you might recall. I just love that tidbit, so I wanted to throw it in there before I close it out. I could go on all day long, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. Yes?
Could you give us a brief history of this building? My youngest aunt, I think, first worked in this thing when it was first.
The question is, can I give a history of the Bennett Martin Library building? No. I did research it a little bit, and I might be mistaken, but I believe that after this building was constructed, it was added onto, and this was not here. Ryan, please, everybody, Ryan Weber, Weber, the head of Lincoln City Libraries. Please, the floor is yours.
So what's interesting is we just received a check from the Carnegie Foundation that has been awarded to us because on this site in 1902 was originally a Carnegie Library. It was around until 1962, 63. And what was the question?
What's the history?
Oh, this building, yeah. So that is the history. A Carnegie Library. So yeah, Andrew Carnegie was a wealthy guy. You've all heard of him from out east in Pittsburgh, and a steel man, oil man. And he supported the construction of libraries all over the country. And we had at one point here in Lincoln 5, and our original Carnegie Library sat here. So a big classical looking type building taken down in the early 1960s. This building then, an L-shaped building that was 2 floors, was built at that point, opened in 63. And at that time, they realized they didn't have the building that they originally wanted. It was originally going to go across the street, kind of next to the bank over there. And in 1967, another addition was built on. And then in 1977, the upper 2 floors here were built. So this building is actually built in 3 different sections. There you go.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah. I knew all that. I'm just kidding. I didn't know any of that. I really appreciate Ryan saying that. That's cool. And Ryan's not even from Lincoln, so he's done his research. Here's to him. Any more questions? Yes.
Do you know from your studies, like, what about the oldest dated picture of Lincoln or the Lincoln area is?
The question is, what's the oldest dated picture of Lincoln? Well, I can tell you this. None of them are dated.
Okay.
But there are some really old pictures, and I included the oldest ones I could find that were somewhat clear in this book. The oldest pictures of Lincoln came from were of around 9th and O Street that I've found, when they had a livery stable and a couple houses. And those are included in this book, and they would have been about 1865 or 1866, maybe 1867, somewhere in that era. As soon as Lincoln was named as the capital city, Lancaster became Lincoln, then we got a lot of photos. And what's so cool is as soon as the Capitol was built, the minute the dome was done enough to where people could get up there, people got up on the dome and started taking pictures. Specifically the Burlington Company, because the Burlington, Missouri was the first railroad to come through. And they wanted to promote Lincoln. They made a lot of money by using these rails. So I believe Burlington hired a photographer to go around and take photos to show this growing city. And that's where this image came from. The image on the cover of the book shows the Kennard House, which is still standing, from the vantage point of the dome of the state capitol. And you can see there's no trees. The photographer that took this photo took photos in every direction, and I've created somewhat of a panorama in the book of each image that goes around, and there are virtually no trees. We can date it to 1871, I believe, those images. So there's a lot. Like I said, I think I have about 300 or more images from the State Historical Society in here, many of which I don't believe have ever been published in books before. So it was a fun opportunity to share those images and give my little insights on those. Yes?
Was the first area of Lincoln to be developed, was that down by the Russian Bottoms, the Russian Museum?
Not exactly. The way Lincoln started was the first white people to come here, because I want to be clear, the indigenous people were here long before the European settlers. They came here for the salt. The surveyors came, found the salt flats, and once the word got back to Nebraska City, they started sending people back here to get salt. And one of those people that started harvesting salt before anyone else was J. Sterling Morton, who sent his people here to harvest salt. And they built little huts in the salt flats. So really the first kind of settlement in this area would have been in the salt flats, down where Oak Creek and Salt Creek converge. Interesting side note to that story, you might be aware that J. Sterling Morton's son ended up getting a taste for salt. Went to Chicago, started working in the salt business, and eventually that became Morton Salt. So that all started with their interest in salt here. Another interesting little tidbit in my research was that J. Sterling Morton, he was in the government. He was a territorial legislator, I believe, and maybe even had a higher up position in the government. He was able to give out military warrants, to help veterans and people obtain land. And he used these warrants to try to obtain land around the salt flats. And once Nebraska became a state, our courts were burdened with trying to settle how that land would be distributed. That's what I read through my research. I don't know that that's what happened, but isn't that the interesting thing about history is we only know as much as what we can learn from what other people wrote. And that's part of the reason I put this book together, is try to preserve that and continue the history in the correct manner.
I thought of something else.
Yes, please.
Did you do any research or write a book or anything about when the city of Lancaster went to Omaha and stole all the records?
So, yes, I did research on that a lot, and I could talk about that for another half hour. As many of you know, the territorial capital was in Omaha. It got, once we became a state in 1867, the legislature decided that we would relocate the capital from Omaha to appease the people south of the Platte River, and it'd be renamed Lincoln, which they didn't think the people that the south of the Platte would want, because they were considered more sympathizers with the Confederacy. Because this is, remember, towards the end of Civil War, in that era. Well, the people south of the Platte said, we don't care what you name it, we'll take it. And so then they sent 3 representatives from the territorial legislature. They sent the governor, the auditor and state secretary, to find a capital. They were called the Capital Commissioners, and they explored lots of places, Ashland, Yankee Hill, and ultimately chose Lincoln. And then Omaha wasn't happy with that. The people, the legislators up there, they had the documents, and you can't start your legislature having hearings and meetings in the new state capitol building without that paperwork and those documents. And so the governor or the state auditor had the key to the room where the paperwork was, gave it to 3 gentlemen, and those 3 gentlemen went to Omaha, and in the dark of the night, tried to get back all the documents and even some of the furniture, I believe, that would go with the state capitol. One of those gentlemen was named Cropsey, and where the governor's mansion is now was the home of a Cropsey. And the Cropsey family were some of the first here in Lincoln. But that Cropsey, they got to Omaha, they got all the paperwork, they got out, and they escaped. But while they were coming back to Lincoln, they got to Plattsmouth and couldn't cross the Platte because the weather was very poor and there was ice on the water. And the gentleman running the ferry said the ferry was broken. And this Cropsey guy says, "We'll make it work." And they said, "No, you won't." And maybe there's a little embellishment here. Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. But according to legend, the Cropsey guy, they wouldn't have got the paperwork here if it wasn't for that Cropsey. But because the weather was so bad and their wagon was so overloaded, normally what would be like a 1 or 2 day trip took them 6 or 7 days. And they had to pay people along the way to stay at their homes. And by the time they got back, they didn't have their watches. They didn't have they had to give up. And the governor had promised that he'd make sure they got paid back, and they never did. Because soon after, the governor was impeached for fraudulent use of state funds. I shouldn't say fraudulent, that's a little strong. But he was impeached because of some money moving around not as it was supposed to.
I keep thinking of questions.
Please, ask another question.
Nebraska originally had 2 houses in the Senate.
Okay, we had a 2-house legislature. I mentioned A.E. Sheldon earlier. A.E. Sheldon was one of the proponents of taking our 2-house legislature and creating a unicameral for budgetary reasons and other reasons, and for expedience. What I think is interesting, the state capitol was built between 1925 and 1935, and they built it around the previous state capitol, but it housed a House chamber and a Senate chamber. The Senate chamber is still there, but it hasn't been used since we created a unicameral in the 1930s. The interesting little tidbit of that is if you go into that Senate chamber, the names on the wall, where it shows the voting tally, they're still the members of the Senate in the 1930s. And that's the room that has the Native Americans carved into the door. And that, I believe, that carving was created, if I'm not mistaken, by Lorenzo Keats, which is another fascinating story.
Wasn't there also another state that had a unicameral, but where?
The question is, was there another state that had a unicameral? There might have been, but I don't know. I know there's only one other state that separates their delegates for federal elections, and I believe that's Maine. So, but I don't know about another state having a unicameral legislature. Yes.
So there's so many different stories in there, but one that captured my imagination was the hippie house in South Lincoln with the motorcycle.
Okay. Leslie asked about the hippie house. A lot of you might remember Pauley Lumber. Pauley Lumber Company, they had a lumber yard down on 27th between Randolph and Capitol Parkway. The Pauley family, the 2 of the Pauley family members, brothers, built homes a block from each other. One is on the corner of 26th and C Street on the northwest corner, and the other Pauley house is at the corner of 25th and B Street, 26th and B on the southeast corner. The house at 26th and B, I call it a mission-style house, stucco, clay tile, that kind of thing, like a Spanish mission. It eventually went from the Pauley family. It became a rental, and while it was a rental, it was occupied by some of the hippies in Lincoln culture. One of whom was S. Clay Wilson, who became a cartoonist, a pretty well-known cartoonist. But they rode their motorcycles through the house. The cops were there all the time. And when, what's his name, the poet, came to town in the 60s at the invite of Carl Shapiro, Ginsburg. Ginsburg came to town, and where he was supposed to stay, everybody knew, and they wanted to hang out with him, and he couldn't get any privacy. So he went and stayed at this house at 26th and B, where he could get a little more privacy and where they could walk around naked and smoke their marijuana and recite their poetry. And so that house, it's kind of got an interesting legend to it. And I included that in the book. That house is still standing, and I used to live a block away from it. And it's always a fascination of mine. So it's fun to be able to take what was one time a mystery to me and put it in here and write about it and learn about all the interesting things. One night there was a party there, and the cops came, and this police officer walked in, and he said, "Who left the burnout on the floor?" Because someone was doing burnouts with their motorcycle on the floor of that house. I have been in the house. I have not seen the burnout marks in the floor. I think they've been refinished. Any other questions? Yes.
The clergy people who provided the guns for the breakout,
Yes.
has there been any theory that were they simply immoral clergy people, or were they victims of blackmail? And it would have worked that when the clergy people were making a call on them, they said, "We have friends outside, and they know where your family lives, and there's one way you can save them."
I can answer that question, I think. But it still requires speculation on my part, but it's based on a pretty in-depth study. You ever known people that fall in love with prisoners? We hear about it all the time. Sympathetic towards criminals. I believe the clergy that came in was a pastor from, I believe, a different town, not around Lincoln. And he would bring with him a couple of, some women, and I believe they were sympathetic to the prisoner's plight. And I think that's how it happened. I don't know this for sure, but that's what the speculation was in this book. So I think it was more that than the possibility of blackmail or anything like that. Any more questions? Seeing none? Deb?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Matt again for this really interesting, and he'll be here selling his books.
Was there one more question, Deb?
Okay.
Yes.
What's your next book?
It's already finished, but it's being edited as we speak every day. I wrote a book titled The Truth, If You Can Handle It. And it takes all the photos from my first book and incorporates it into a philosophical book about the degradation of truth. I don't know if any of you know, I argued about libel and slander in front of the Nebraska Supreme Court years ago, having been a victim of some false statements made about me publicly. And so that was one part of this motivation to put together this book titled The Truth, If You Can Handle It. And because it's been fascinating to me how truth is degraded over my lifetime and how the value of honor and integrity is no longer appreciated or respected like it was when I was a kid. And so I wrote about that, and I put a lot of philosophical quotes in that book. And the first philosophical quote, I wrote it under my alter ego's name, Matthias Yoder. And the alter ego, the first quote by Matthias Yoder in the entire book says, if you want to upset somebody, tell them a lie. But if you want to make an enemy for life, tell them the truth. And the truth is toxic. I can tell you right now, we talked about the naked people on the Woodman building. I posted on Facebook that these people were never naked. They always had the adults. The kids are naked. The adults are not. They have pants on. They're partly clothed, and it's pretty revealing, but they're not nude. There was a lot of pushback. A lot of people said no, they were nude. They don't appreciate the truth, and so that's what we have to deal with, is that sometimes people don't appreciate truth, and I wrote a book about it. But it's so hard to finish, because when I wrote that book, when I finished it, AI wasn't a thing, and now it is, and it evolves every single day. So like this book, I'm going to have to make a hard deadline on myself and finish that book, but that's the next one, The Truth, If You Can Handle It, by Matthias Yoder.
Okay, the Woodman building.
Yes.
the naked, not naked people. I thought at one time there was a bunch of scaffolding up there and they were putting,
Everybody brings up, I'm going to interrupt, she mentioned the scaffolding on the Woodman building. I want to, it is very much possible that there was scaffolding put up in front of that building, just like it was at the Capitol, to restore and preserve the limestone and to clean it. And that would make sense, you know, to seal those cracks and gaps and clean off any moss that might have been.
wasn't to dress the naked, no.
It wasn't to add clothing to the naked people. Yes.
Because the act of sculpture is reductive. You take a block and you chip stuff away. You cannot add it back.
Kim points out something that I think is pretty obvious to most of us, that you can't add stone after, this is a relief sculpture, which means we've taken off the stone, and you can't add it. One of the arguments was that they applied gauze and plaster to add stone to this. That was one of the arguments that I received that justified, I am in agreement. I just want to give both sides. Fair and objective, right?
We do have to wrap up.
Thank you.
But he'll be here selling books, so you can ask him some questions as he does that. And I do want to, because you wrote the unauthorized biography of Lincoln, here's an official City of Lincoln t-shirt as our thanks for you doing this.
Thank you, Deb.
So thank
I
you.
love this.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.